Hello, and thanks for stopping by. This is Spreadsheet Excellence, and I'm Joe Pryor. We're on episode 7, so we're nearing the end of our first season, and in this episode, we're going to spend the entire time talking about pivot tables. Now, pivot tables are kind of intimidating, and the hope is that this episode is going to make them accessible and understandable to even an introductory user to Excel. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and jump right in? Okay, so here we are. We're at the data that we're going to be using for our pivot test experiment. And I know in the last episode I said, hey, we're done with what we built in the course of the last couple episodes, but we're building on the foundation that we built in our report here. You'll notice that our location names carry over into our new data. So what we're looking at is a more detailed view of each of these locations, and it tells us what region they're in and also what departments are contained within each location. And then we also get an access to how much staff at that location is assigned to each department. We're also given a revenue and an operating expense. Now, again, all of this data is, dummy data, but hopefully we can use this to illustrate the power of a pivot table. However, the first thing that we need to do in order to more easily access pivot tables and the opportunity that I have to show you another cool function in Excel is we need to take this and format it as a table. So formatting this as a table gives us a lot of functionality out of the gate before we even do anything else. So come up here into the Home ribbon and click on Format as Table. Now you're going to get a drop down or pull down box that gives you a couple of different options in terms of how you want to present this table. And then we'll also ask you if you have headers. Now a header is this stuff up here, region, location, etc., etc. It's how Excel flags a data type. And you'll notice that we've also flagged all of this as accounting data or put it in the format of money. Everything else is just general data type. So you can go for you can see here when you click it, it asks you to define the term. Notice that we go from top left, A1, to bottom right, F26 or Fox 26, and we have the little colon in between. Also notice that these are absolute references. Money signs in between all of the characters means that we can move this and it will go with us. So this is the table. And if you wanted to set something different, you could set something different by clicking the little up arrow and selecting different terrain or cells. And then you could tick on or tick off my table has headers if that were not the case. Best practice going forward for you, always put headers in there before you start. It just saves you a lot of headaches in the future. So we're going to go ahead and click OK. And now it's a table. Now let's go ahead and zoom in on our data. And we have a new tab has appeared, the Table Design tab. All right, so the first thing we're going to do when we come to our new table is we're going to inspect this new tab that's appeared, the Table Design tab. This only appears when you have a table, obviously. And the first thing we're going to do is rename it. And we're going to go ahead and name it Regional Performance. Now notice here, I'm using an underscore in between the two words. You can't put spaces in the names of these tables, so you need to find some other way to separate the words. So you could use an underscore, you could use a dash, you could just do camel case. This is a little hard to see here, but capital R, regional, and then capital P, performance. That's called camel case, starting each new word with a capital letter. But I like the underscore. It mimics the effect of a space, and we can move on with our lives. You have a couple of basic options here. You could remove duplicated values. We don't want to do that because sometimes it's possible that these locations have the same expenses or the same revenues, and that's appropriate. And then headcount might be the same as well. We come over here. We have a lot of options for adding new data to the column. It's not relevant for us to do that right now. And then we can also format the style. So I always kind of have this preference for dark themed or night themed content. So I like to do this dark stuff, but it doesn't present very well. So this blue is a very fetching color. And the standard stuff there's nothing wrong with it either. The standard stuff totally works. I really do like when they do this sort of alternated color, just because it helps you track across a long sheet of data. Now, in this instance, we have a fairly small data set, but a larger table would be maybe harder to keep track of. And I think let's go with this. This is nice. Looks good. Okay, whatever. It's not relevant, but it's important to know that you do have this appear. Notice it goes away when you're not selecting it, and then it appears again up here. So if you're building a table, this is the first thing you need to do. Now, we have as well some core functionality with regard to the table just before we even do pivot stuff. So each of these little arrows here lets you select, filter to certain content. So let's say we only want to see the north region, or we only want to see everything else but the north region. We can click on these little tick boxes. You get the idea. And that works for all of this stuff. You can kind of also have it sort by smallest, so you can see our smallest departments. Apparently, accessories and haberdashery is one of the smaller departments, and we can also go the inverse and have our largest departments as well. And the important thing of a table is now we can just select any cell in this table, and we can go to Insert, the Insert tab, and we can select Pivot Table. Now, if we hadn't done this extra step, we would need to draw a box around all this stuff and then select Pivot Table. So it's not like it's that much more work to do that, but I do like making things as a table. Let's sort by region like we had before. So click in here, and we're going to make a pivot table. Boom. This gives you the pivot table creation plot. And if you have any questions about what this stuff does, feel free to click on the little question mark. It'll start giving you a tutorial on how to utilize pivot tables. And as usual, Microsoft's tutorials are actually pretty good. So if you need a little bit of extra content, that would be a good place to look. You have a couple of different options here. This asks you what table you want to use. Notice that we were using regional performance, and we renamed it up here in this little box here, or in the table design box, we renamed it here. So this is the name of the table. You could select different cells if you were so inclined. We're not. We like this table, but you could. And then it will ask you where you want this pivot table to go. Now, if you've got an existing worksheet you want to put it on, great, click that. It'll tell you it's the same prompt, right? You can click in here and then go somewhere in Excel and tell it where to go. But I always prefer to have it create in a fresh, new worksheet. And what this will do is it will create a new tab for us right on there, sheet 4. And we can use this as our pivot table. Boom, pivot table. All right, so the pivot table interface is a bit intimidating at first. So let's break it down into its individual components and then start playing with our data. Okay, so we're looking at our pivot table, and we have this sort of block dropped on what appears to be an otherwise normal Excel spreadsheet. And this is kind of how we initiate interaction with the pivot table interface. Notice when I click outside of it, it goes away. So we click in here, and we have all of the columns that we saw in our table here. So region, location, department, etc. Those all appear here. And then we have filters, columns, rows, and values. Rows and columns are pretty straightforward. Columns and rows. Filters, the name should hopefully give it away. You can filter in or out by certain things. And then the values segment here, this is where we kind of get to do some of our analysis. So when I was first learning pivot tables, I kind of just dropped stuff in here at random, and I was just sort of like, all right, let's see what comes out of this. But let's say we have you're used to seeing already all of our locations, and they've been presented typically in a fashion like this, which is to say each location is its own row. But we can actually add a layer of extra information on top of that. We can drag out the location and drag in. We can click on region right here, and we'll put it down there, or we can drag it down there. The same thing. We just, you're getting. So we already knew there were 4 regions. This isn't really great information. It's not rocket science at this point. But one of the cool things is if you bring down location as well, you now get nested fields here. So in the East region, there's Buffalo and Queens Ridge. In the North region, there's Bedford, Buckley, and Near North, et cetera, et cetera. This is pretty cool. So instead of this, where you kind of, your eyes go cross-eyed looking at it, you've got this. That's much cleaner. That really presents a lot of clean, good data. Now, the really nifty thing is when you start throwing in the numbers. So we can drop value down here, revenue, and this just automatically adds up all of the revenue for each of these locations and then aggregates it up to the region. So let's drop the location out again. So now we have our region income. This is just the income, just the revenue. Now right now it's just a number like this, but we can easily convert it just like we would on a normal Excel sheet to an accounting format. And then there's no cents that matter. So let's drop that. And so now we have it in, dollars and cents as the case might be. But maybe you want to zoom in and you'd like to figure out by department. How's each department within the region doing? Actually, let's get rid of the region altogether. What's our best performing department? Well, it appears to be electronics, but it's right there in the middle and it's kind of awkward. So what you can also do when you have numbers like this is you can right click on a data, any cell really, and you get a pop-up here like you would anywhere else, and you can get sort. There's a little pull-out box over here. You can get summarize as well. We'll talk about that in a second, the value thing down here. But the options here as well. And you can also confirm all kinds of cool things in terms of how you would calculate that number. So the first thing we're going to do is sort from largest to smallest, and then boom, electronics, which is apparently our best performer, but cosmetics is right behind it, comes to the top, and then it looks like shoes has not a great revenue, evidently. So when you right click on this data, you get a lot of really powerful stuff in these pop-ups, the sort options. You can also change what exactly these are. So they're just summing everything right now. So it's just summing everything right now, but you could, there's a number of other things you can do with this. You can get the average revenue by department. You can get the min, the lowest. So who's the worst performer? You can alternatively do the opposite, get the maximum performer, all this kind of stuff. And you'll notice that when we do this, it keeps on moving around which departments are where, because these things start to, they reorder themselves. Let's go back to our sum. Boom. All right, cool. You can also do some quick on-the-fly calculations. A really good one in this particular instance would be, for example, percent of column total. So this gives you an idea that electronics represents 27.32% of our total revenue as a source of revenue. So it's a high performer, where by comparison, footwear doesn't appear to be making as much revenue from a raw percentage. But maybe that's a loss leader. Maybe that's what gets folks in the store, and then while they're buying footwear, we sell them a pedometer or an iPod or something, or an iPhone. I'm dating myself. These kinds of quick calculations that you can do, no calculations again, are very useful. Let's go ahead and add in our expenses. And then what we can do now is we can actually on the fly create a new field that doesn't otherwise exist. And we can do a quick calculation, and Excel will do this for us. So what we do is we click into our pivot table, come over here to the new tab that gets created, Pivot Table Analyze, And you'll see some of the things we've been looking at, the pivot table name, for example, some of the settings. And the specific one I want you to take a look at now is fields, items, and sets. Create and modify calculated fields. All right. So we're going to go ahead and create a calculated field. We're going to call it head count efficiency. If you're, you'll see on the right there, I've already had to create it. There's a couple of times just for testing purposes. And we'll call this, I guess, 3 because that's what we're going to do. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and take our margin. I'll get rid of that 0. Take our margin. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate our margin. Well, we'll take a look at, I've already calculated this, but you would go through this the exact same process. And essentially what you would do here is you would, in your calculated field, in margin, is what you would do is you take you take revenue minus expenses and create the new field margin. When you create a calculated field, it creates a new item on this drop-down picker list. Now, this item is not created. No, I can't expand out of here. All right, that's fine. So we're going to take margin, and we're going to divide it by staff. And this should give us an idea of how much of our margin is each staffer making. It's not obviously going to be efficient, like evenly divided, but it will give us an idea of where maybe we're a little headcount heavy or headcount light, as the case might be. Now, I've already created this twice, but you'll see what happens. It creates another one of these instances. So each person at these departments at the departmental level is earning us this much money, as the case might be. So let's go ahead and remove revenue and operating expenses and just drop in margin. Drop in margin above headcount efficiency. So when you reorder these things, you figure out where they're going. And let's do this less by department, because I think we already know that electronics and cosmetics have been our constant performers. Largest to smallest. Yep, cosmetics and electronics. And the headcount margin is surprisingly thin. Where haberdashery, which is fancy hats, the haberdasher apparently is very efficient from a manpower perspective or a person power perspective. By comparison, footwear and women's wear, less effective. This is all dummy data. It's not based on reality. Electronics and cosmetics, though, these are really efficient fields, and that's just because they probably come from a very high revenue. Let's do this less on department, though, and more on location. And let's go ahead and drop region in there as well. Oh, let's reorder those. There you go. Great. So this gives us an idea of the best performing regions, and that's going to end up being the South region, looks like. Nope, the West region, and then the South. There, I called it quickly. Without belaboring it, I'm not going to run a full analysis because this is all dummy data. But you get the idea of the power of a pivot table. I'm now manipulating 2 different data types that don't exist here in the base data, but are derived from the base data. Our operating margin comes from revenue minus expense, and our headcount efficiency is that margin divided against the staff, total staff of that location. So Bedford, for example, has 22 folks, and then that's the margin divided against that. So you have a lot of powerful tools at your hands when it comes to pivot tables. There's one last thing I want to walk through in regard to pivot tables, and that's this filter box or filter option. And what it does is when you drop an item in filter, it populates that up here in the top left as a filter. So for example, if I was to take a region and drop it in filter instead, you would kind of the same way that you can filter here at the table level, you'd be able to do the same thing in the pivot table. So you could just filter out for the east and the north region, or you know what, let's just take a look at just the south. All right, cool. So it's the same kind of idea as what you would see in terms of the nested data, like here. You have the same information. This is the south, etc. But let's say you have all this data and you want to take a look at departments now, right? So now you've got all the departments, but I want to see, let me see, just electronics, just the stores, just the regions that have electronics, and see how they're doing. Or, you know, I like my fancy hats. Let's take a look at how the haberdashers are doing. Oh, they're losing money in the loop. These are the examples of what you can do. You add filters, that kind of thing. So filters allow you to play with the data as it's presented in the same manner as you would with the table, but in a pivot table. Okay, so one last thing before we wrap up today's episode about pivot tables is if there's a particularly interesting piece of data that you like, you can kind of double click on it and it'll break out into a new sheet that just zooms in on that specific piece of data in the same manner as a table. And you'll see, oh, okay, this is all the departments that are within the LaGrange location. And you can do that for kind of anything that you see on here. So today we've talked about pivot tables, how to create a table, how to create a pivot table. It's right over here in the Insert tab, Pivot Tables. There's also the recommended pivot tables that Microsoft put together for you. As often as not, they're not great. But sometimes they get lucky, especially if you've got simplistic data. But you know, come over here, the pivot table. We've talked about the pivot table creation prompt. We've also talked about the way that the various boxes here can interact with pivot tables and how you can build new columns of data with the calculated field, and what that can do for your analysis, how you can sort that data, and how you can manipulate it into being a percentage or anything else. So, hey guys, thank you very much for sticking this one out. And we're going to do a wrap up in the next episode. We're going to talk a little bit about graphing, and then we'll kick it off into the next season. So I'll talk about that more in the next episode. But until then, this is Joe, and I'm saying stay excellent, everyone. See you in the next one. Bye.